If she doesn't stop praying, I'm calling the flight attendant right now, the man said in a low, irritated voice that cut through the hum of the airplane cabin like a sharp wire. The words landed in the tight space between rows of seats on Flight 417 from Chicago to Denver, where the air already felt heavy with the scent of recycled oxygen and cheap coffee. A few passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen, but everyone did. At the window seat of row 12, Alicia Carter kept her head slightly bowed, her hands folded together in quiet prayer, her lips moving barely enough to notice unless someone was looking for a reason to notice her at all. She was 34, an ER nurse from Southside Chicago, still wearing the exhaustion of a 14-hour shift in the soft shadows under her eyes, her navy jacket wrinkled from rushing straight from the hospital to the airport with barely 10 minutes to spare. She wasn't loud. She wasn't disruptive. She was just present in a way that made some people uncomfortable, as if her stillness itself was an interruption. Across the aisle, a man in a crisp white button-down leaned toward his seatmate, his voice deliberately louder now, as if inviting agreement. "It's a shared space," he said. "People shouldn't be doing that kind of thing in public like this." The seatmate gave a small, uncertain nod, while a woman 2 rows back glanced down at her phone, recording without saying a word. The cabin crew, moving down the aisle with a beverage cart, slowed slightly as they sensed the shift in atmosphere, but kept their professional smiles intact. Alicia didn't respond. She didn't look up. Her attention stayed anchored somewhere far beyond the narrow seatback tray table in front of her, somewhere quieter than the murmurs growing around her. She had learned long ago in emergency rooms that silence could either be peace or warning, and right now, she needed peace more than anything else in the world. The man who had spoken earlier, David Whitmore, a mid-level corporate consultant traveling first class on a discounted upgrade, exhaled sharply as if personally offended by her presence. He adjusted his watch, a stainless steel piece that caught the cabin light every time he moved, and leaned slightly into the aisle again. "I'm serious," he said, this time directed at the flight attendant approaching from the front. "It's distracting. We shouldn't have to deal with this for a 2-hour flight." The flight attendant paused, her eyes briefly scanning Alicia, then the surrounding passengers, calculating tone, tension, and policy in a fraction of a second the way trained crew always did. Alicia finally opened her eyes but did not move, her expression calm, steady, almost distant. Outside the oval window, the sky stretched wide and pale blue over the Midwest, clouds scattered like uneven brushstrokes across an unfinished canvas. Somewhere far below, towns and highways continued their quiet routines, unaware of the small storm forming above them in a sealed aluminum tube at 35,000 feet. No one in the cabin knew yet that the turbulence warning light had already flickered on in the cockpit, or that Captain Miller's hands had tightened slightly on the controls as he studied the approaching weather pattern ahead. For now, all they knew was the sound of a woman praying softly under her breath and the growing discomfort of a man who believed it shouldn't be allowed. The cabin lights shifted slightly as the airplane continued its steady climb, the soft hum of the engines filling the narrow space with a constant vibration that passengers usually stopped noticing after a few minutes. Yet in row 12, attention had not settled. It had spread quietly, like ripples that refused to fade. Alicia Carter remained still, her hands resting in her lap now, her breathing slow and measured, as if she had stepped outside the tension rather than inside it. The man across the aisle, David Whitmore, checked his phone again, then leaned back with a sigh that carried more frustration than comfort. "It is not about religion," he said to no one in particular, though his voice was clearly meant to travel. "It is about consideration for everyone else on board." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, caught between agreement and hesitation, unsure which side of discomfort they belonged to. A woman 2 rows back lowered her phone slightly, still recording, but now pretending she was not. The flight attendant returned down the aisle, her expression composed, but her eyes more focused than before, scanning faces, reading tones, measuring a situation that was becoming heavier without ever becoming loud. Alicia finally adjusted her seatbelt slightly, not because she felt pressured, but because her body had grown accustomed to preparing for moments that required stillness under strain. In her memory, flashes of hospital corridors flickered faintly, not as dramatic images, but as sensations, The steady rhythm of monitors, the controlled urgency of voices that learned to stay calm even when everything else did not. She exhaled softly and closed her eyes again, not in retreat, but in continuation, as if the world outside her thoughts was secondary to something deeper she was trying to hold on to. The aircraft made a subtle dip, almost unnoticeable, but enough for a few passengers to glance up. The seatbelt signs above flickered on with a soft chime, and the captain's voice came through the overhead speakers, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are encountering a light area of turbulence ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The words were simple, but the effect in the cabin was immediate. Conversations lowered. Shoulders tightened. Eyes began to scan the ceiling as if it might provide answers. David straightened in his seat, his earlier irritation now mixing with something less controlled. "Of course," he muttered, gripping the armrest slightly tighter. "This is exactly what I mean." Alicia opened her eyes again, this time looking out the window. The sky outside had not changed in color, still pale and endless, but the clouds below seemed denser now, layered like quiet mountains shifting under invisible pressure. The aircraft gave another gentle sway, and the woman recording 2 rows back finally lowered her phone completely, her attention no longer focused on capturing moments, but on surviving them. The flight attendant moved again through the aisle, this time securing loose items and offering quiet reassurance to passengers with practiced calm. No one spoke directly to Alicia now, but she could feel the shift. The earlier annoyance had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by something more fragile, something that did not need words to be understood. David glanced sideways at her for the first time without speaking, as if noticing something he had ignored before, the absence of panic, the stillness that did not match the rising unease around her. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft adjusted altitude, and for a brief moment, everything felt suspended, not falling, not rising, just waiting in a space where certainty had not yet returned. The aircraft continued to move through the sky, with a steadiness that no longer felt fully reassuring, as if the earlier calm had become something fragile rather than stable. The overhead lights remained dimmed, casting a soft amber glow across rows of passengers who now sat more upright than before, their earlier distractions replaced by quiet attention to every subtle sound and motion. Alicia Carter remained in the same position, her hands resting gently together, her gaze lowered but not closed, as if she was listening to something beyond the cabin itself. Around her, the atmosphere had changed in ways that were not spoken aloud. The man across the aisle, David Whitmore, no longer spoke with the same confidence. His earlier frustration had shifted into a more contained silence, interrupted only by the occasional tightening of his grip on the armrest whenever the airplane gave a slight movement. The woman who had been recording earlier had stopped completely, her phone now resting face down in her lap, forgotten in the presence of something more immediate than documentation. The flight attendant moved carefully through the aisle, ensuring that overhead compartments were secure and that passengers were properly seated, her voice low and steady as she reassured those who asked quiet questions. Outside the oval windows, the sky had begun to change in subtle ways, the smooth gradient of blue now interrupted by thicker formations of cloud that gathered in uneven clusters ahead. The captain's voice returned through the speakers, still controlled but slightly more deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjusting our altitude to navigate through a developing weather system. We expect some moderate turbulence for a brief period. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened." A few passengers exchanged glances, their expressions tightening with the realization that the earlier light turbulence warning had evolved into something less predictable. The aircraft responded with a gentle but noticeable dip, followed by a slight rise that pressed passengers momentarily into their seats before releasing them again. It was not dramatic, but it was enough to remove any remaining illusion of stillness. David looked out toward the window, his jaw set, as if trying to maintain control over something that was no longer responding to intention. For the first time since the disagreement began, his expression softened into uncertainty rather than irritation. Alicia, however, remained unchanged in her posture. She shifted slightly, not in response to fear, but in quiet adjustment. as if aligning herself with the rhythm of something she understood differently than those around her. Her lips moved faintly again, not louder than before, but with the same steady cadence that had drawn attention earlier. A nearby passenger glanced at her, then quickly looked away, no longer with annoyance, but with a kind of unsettled curiosity. The aircraft jolted again, a bit stronger this time, causing a brief wave of tension to pass through the cabin. Small gasps were heard, quickly controlled as passengers tightened their seatbelts instinctively. The flight attendant paused briefly, bracing herself with one hand against the seat back, then continued forward with practiced composure. David exhaled slowly, his earlier certainty now replaced by a quiet stillness that felt unfamiliar to him. He looked at Alicia again, this time not with complaint or judgment, but with the cautious awareness of someone realizing that the presence he had questioned was not affected in the way he expected. Outside, the clouds thickened further, the aircraft entering a stretch of sky where motion became less predictable, and every movement carried a reminder that control was shared rather than owned. The cabin, once divided by opinion, now sat unified in silence, each passenger waiting for what would come next without knowing who, if anyone, would remain the same when it passed. The cabin had entered a quieter kind of tension, the kind that does not come from noise but from anticipation, as if every passenger had begun to wait for something they could not name. The aircraft continued its steady forward motion, yet the feeling inside the cabin was no longer steady at all. Alicia Carter remained composed in her seat, her posture unchanged, her hands still gently folded, her expression calm in a way that contrasted sharply with the shifting energy around her. The earlier irritation that had once been directed at her had now dissolved into a broader uncertainty that seemed to belong to everyone at once. David Whitmore no longer spoke. His phone remained in his hand, but he was not looking at it. Instead, his eyes were fixed somewhere ahead, unfocused, as if trying to interpret every slight movement of the plane. The flight attendant moved carefully down the aisle again, checking seatbelts and overhead bins with measured precision, her steps steady even as the cabin's subtle movements increased. Outside the windows, the sky had grown more complex, with layered clouds stacking into uneven formations that suggested deeper atmospheric instability ahead. The aircraft gave a gentle but noticeable shift, causing a synchronized tightening of posture among passengers who were now fully aware that the earlier warning had progressed into something more sustained. The captain's voice returned once more through the speakers, still calm, but now carrying a more deliberate clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing moderate turbulence as we navigate around a weather front. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation. The words were steady, but they no longer carried the ease they once had. A few passengers closed their eyes. Others stared forward in silence. Alicia's breathing remained slow and even, her attention focused inward rather than on the movements around her. Her lips moved again briefly, continuing the same quiet rhythm she had maintained since the beginning of the flight. A passenger across the aisle, previously indifferent, now glanced at her with a different expression, one that carried hesitation rather than judgment. The aircraft shifted more noticeably, a deeper sway that caused drinks to tremble slightly in plastic cups and caused seatbacks to creak under shifting weight. A low murmur passed through the cabin, quickly suppressed by the collective instinct to remain composed. David finally tightened his grip on the armrest, his earlier confidence now fully replaced by a quiet alertness. He looked toward Alicia again, and for the first time, he did not look away immediately afterward. There was something unsettling in her calmness, not because it was strange, but because it was consistent. It did not rise or fall with the movements of the aircraft. The turbulence increased in intensity, not dangerously abrupt, but steady and persistent, creating a rhythm that forced every passenger to acknowledge their lack of control. The flight attendant paused briefly, bracing herself as she steadied a passing cart, then continued forward with professional focus. Alicia adjusted her position slightly, still calm, still grounded, her presence unchanged despite the shifting environment around her. The cabin, once divided by opinion, now shared a single quiet awareness. Everything outside their seats had become unpredictable, and every breath felt measured against something larger than comfort. The aircraft continued to move through the unstable airspace with a rhythm that felt less like steady flight and more like careful negotiation with invisible forces, each adjustment in altitude creating subtle waves of motion that passed through the cabin like silent instructions no one could ignore. The overhead lighting remained dim and constant, but the atmosphere beneath it had shifted into something heavier, as if the air itself had gained weight. Alicia Carter remained seated in the same composed posture, her presence unchanged despite the growing instability around her. Her hands were still gently folded, her head slightly bowed, and her breathing steady in a way that seemed increasingly disconnected from the rising unease shared by everyone else on board. David Whitmore sat rigidly across the aisle, his earlier frustration completely replaced by a quiet alertness that now bordered on discomfort. His eyes moved between the seatbelt sign above and the window beside him, tracking every subtle movement of the aircraft, as if searching for reassurance in external patterns. The flight attendant made another careful pass through the aisle, her hand briefly steadying the seatbacks as the plane shifted again, her voice calm as she reminded passengers to remain seated and secure. Outside the windows, the sky had become a layered expanse of shifting gray and pale light, with clouds thickening into formations that no longer felt distant but immediate, surrounding the aircraft in every direction. The turbulence increased in consistency, not sudden but sustained, creating a continuous sensation of motion that made stillness feel temporary rather than guaranteed. A few passengers closed their eyes tightly, while others stared forward with fixed expressions, holding onto armrests or tray tables as if they provided structure beyond their physical function. Alicia's lips continued to move in quiet rhythm, her focus inward, her composure uninterrupted. A nearby passenger who had earlier shown irritation now glanced at her repeatedly, as if trying to reconcile the contrast between her calm presence and the shared instability of the cabin. The aircraft dipped slightly, then rose again, causing a synchronized wave of tension through the rows of seats, followed by the soft sounds of controlled breathing and restrained reactions. David finally exhaled deeply, his grip tightening once more before loosening slightly, as if his body was learning to adjust to a new definition of control. He looked toward Alicia again, and this time his expression carried something closer to uncertainty than judgment. The turbulence remained steady, neither escalating nor fully easing, maintaining a constant reminder that the journey had entered a phase where prediction was no longer reliable. The flight attendant paused briefly near the front, speaking quietly into her headset before continuing her measured movement through the aisle. Alicia shifted slightly in her seat, not out of distress, but as a natural adjustment to the plane's motion, her calm demeanor unchanged. The cabin had now fully transitioned into a shared state of attentiveness, where personal distractions no longer held priority, and every passenger seemed aware that they were part of the same fragile environment suspended above the earth. The aircraft continued through the unstable air mass with a steady but increasingly noticeable rhythm of motion that passed through the cabin in waves, each one subtly shifting the balance of every seated passenger. The overhead seatbelt signs remained illuminated, casting a soft amber glow that reinforced the sense of controlled caution throughout the aircraft. Alicia Carter remained in her seat with the same quiet composure she had maintained since the beginning of the flight, her posture unchanged, her hands resting gently together, her expression calm in a way that now stood in contrast to the visible tension around her. The turbulence had become a constant presence rather than a momentary disturbance, shaping the behavior of the entire cabin. David Whitmore sat across the aisle, no longer attempting to speak or express frustration, his earlier confidence fully replaced by a quiet, focused awareness of every movement the aircraft made. His hands rested firmly on the armrests, and his gaze remained fixed forward, occasionally flicking toward the window, as if seeking confirmation that the outside world remained stable even if the interior of the cabin did not. The flight attendant moved with careful precision through the aisle once again, her movements steady and practiced, ensuring that passengers remained secure and that nothing loose could shift during the continued motion. Outside the windows, the sky had become a layered composition of deep gray and soft white formations, with clouds thick enough to obscure any sense of clear horizon, creating a visual environment that reinforced the aircraft's passage through unsettled conditions. The turbulence maintained its presence, neither escalating sharply nor diminishing, but continuing in a sustained pattern that required constant adjustment from both crew and passengers. Alicia's breathing remained slow and consistent, her focus internal rather than reactive, her calm demeanor unchanged despite the shifting pressure around her. Her lips moved faintly in the same steady rhythm she had maintained throughout the flight, her attention directed inward as if anchored to something that did not fluctuate with external conditions. A nearby passenger who had once shown visible irritation now observed her in silence. Their expressions softened into uncertainty, as if the earlier assumption about her behavior no longer aligned with what they were witnessing. The aircraft shifted again, a slightly deeper motion that caused a collective tightening across the cabin, followed by a controlled silence that replaced any previous murmurs. David exhaled slowly, his posture still rigid but less resistant than before, as though adapting to the realization that control was not something he could impose on the environment outside his seat. He glanced toward Alicia again, and this time his gaze lingered, not in judgment, but in a quiet attempt to understand the consistency of her composure. The flight attendant paused briefly near the front of the cabin, speaking softly into her headset before continuing her careful movement through the aisle, her presence a steadying influence within the shifting environment. Alicia adjusted her position slightly, a natural response to the aircraft's motion, but her expression and focus remained unchanged. The cabin, once divided by differing opinions and reactions, had now settled into a unified state of attentive silence, where every passenger shared the same awareness that the journey had entered a phase defined not by comfort or certainty, but by patience and collective endurance. The aircraft continued to move through the layered atmosphere with a steady but unmistakable rhythm of motion that had now become familiar to everyone on board, a constant reminder that the flight was operating within conditions that required patience and trust in systems beyond passenger control. The cabin lighting remained softly dimmed, casting an even glow across rows of seated travelers whose earlier reactions had now settled into a shared quiet awareness. Alicia Carter remained unchanged in her seat, her posture steady, her hands still gently resting together, her expression calm in a way that no longer stood out as unusual, but had instead become a quiet reference point for the surrounding passengers. The turbulence had not disappeared, but it had evolved into a sustained presence, a continuous movement that shaped how everyone breathed, shifted, and waited. David Whitmore sat across the aisle with a stillness that was no longer rooted in confidence or resistance, but in observation. His earlier judgment had fully dissolved into something more uncertain, as if the situation no longer allowed space for assumptions or quick interpretations. His eyes moved occasionally between the window and the seatbelt sign above, which remained illuminated with a steady amber glow, reinforcing the sense that conditions were still not fully stable. The flight attendant continued her careful movement through the aisle, her steps measured and precise, pausing briefly at intervals to ensure passengers were secure and calm. Her presence provided a subtle structure within the cabin, a reminder that despite the instability of the aircraft's environment, there was still order being maintained through trained attention and protocol. Outside the windows, the sky had become a continuous field of dense, shifting cloud layers, with no clear horizon visible, creating a visual impression of moving through an environment without fixed boundaries. The aircraft responded with subtle adjustments in altitude and direction, each one producing gentle but noticeable shifts that rippled through the cabin in waves of motion. Alicia's breathing remained slow and even, her focus internal and steady, her composure unchanged despite the continued movement around her. Her lips moved faintly in the same quiet rhythm, not drawing attention, but maintaining a consistent presence that contrasted with the uncertainty felt by others. A passenger nearby, who had earlier appeared visibly irritated, now watched her intermittently. Their expression softened into something closer to reflection than judgment, as if recalibrating their understanding of what calm could look like under pressure. The aircraft gave another gentle but sustained movement, causing a synchronized tightening across rows of passengers, followed by a controlled silence that replaced any remaining informal noise. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders slightly lower than before, his earlier resistance now replaced by a quieter acceptance of the situation as it unfolded beyond his influence. He looked toward Alicia again, not with suspicion or frustration, but with a steady attention that suggested he was noticing something he had previously dismissed. The flight attendant paused briefly near the front, speaking softly into her headset before continuing her movement, maintaining a calm and consistent presence that helped stabilize the atmosphere within the cabin. Alicia adjusted her position slightly, responding naturally to the aircraft's motion, but her expression remained unchanged, her calm uninterrupted by the environment that continued to shift around her. The cabin had now fully transitioned into a unified state of silent attention, where individual reactions had merged into a collective awareness that the journey was still in progress and required patience, steadiness, and trust in the unseen systems guiding them forward. The aircraft continued its steady passage through the unstable air corridor with a motion that had become both predictable and unsettling at the same time, as if the entire cabin had adapted to a rhythm of uncertainty that no one could fully ignore anymore. The lighting overhead remained constant in its soft amber tone, creating a visual contrast with the shifting tension among passengers who now sat in near-complete silence. Alicia Carter remained in the same composed posture she had maintained since the beginning of the turbulence, her hands still gently folded, her expression calm and steady in a way that now seemed less unusual and more quietly grounding to those around her. The movement of the aircraft continued in subtle but persistent waves, each one passing through the cabin and drawing small, involuntary reactions from passengers who were no longer trying to hide their awareness of the situation. David Whitmore sat across the aisle with a posture that had shifted from rigid control to quiet observation, his earlier discomfort replaced by a more reflective stillness. His gaze no longer carried frustration but instead followed the subtle changes in Alicia's presence, as if trying to understand something that no longer fit within his earlier assumptions. The flight attendant moved carefully through the aisle again, her hand briefly steadying the seatbacks as the aircraft made another gentle shift, her voice calm and measured as she checked on passengers and ensured continued compliance with safety procedures. Outside the windows, the sky had become a continuous gradient of dense cloud formations, with no visible horizon, creating a sense of isolation from any familiar reference point. The aircraft adjusted slightly in response to the atmospheric conditions, producing a soft but noticeable sway that traveled through the cabin in a synchronized wave of movement. A few passengers closed their eyes, while others remained fixed on the front of the cabin, waiting for any change in the captain's tone or instruction. Alicia's breathing remained even and unbroken, her attention directed inward, her calm presence consistent with the same quiet rhythm she had maintained throughout the flight. Her lips moved faintly again, not in response to the environment, but as part of a steady internal focus that did not shift with external conditions. A passenger seated nearby, who had previously shown visible irritation earlier in the flight, now watched her intermittently with a softened expression, as if gradually reassessing the meaning of her composure under pressure. The aircraft gave another sustained motion, not abrupt but long enough to cause a collective tightening among passengers, followed by a brief silence that settled over the cabin like a shared breath held in unison. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly as the earlier tension in his posture eased into something more uncertain and contemplative. He looked toward Alicia again, this time without judgment or expectation, noticing instead the consistency of her calm in contrast to the fluctuating environment around them. The flight attendant paused briefly near the front of the cabin, speaking softly into her headset before continuing her steady movement, maintaining a calm and structured presence that reinforced stability within the shifting atmosphere. Alicia adjusted her position slightly in response to the aircraft's motion, her movements natural and unforced, but her expression remained unchanged, her composure uninterrupted by the continued instability. The cabin had now fully settled into a unified state of attentive silence, where every passenger shared an unspoken awareness that the journey was still in progress, and that patience and quiet endurance had become the only consistent form of control available. The aircraft moved through the air with a steady persistence that no longer felt like simple flight, but like a continuous negotiation between stability and uncertainty, each subtle shift in altitude and direction echoing through the cabin in quiet ways that passengers had now fully learned to anticipate. The lighting remained unchanged, soft and warm, contrasting with the cooler tension that had settled into every row of seats. Alicia Carter remained in her seat with the same composed stillness she had maintained throughout the entire flight, her posture unchanged, her hands gently resting together, her presence steady in a way that no longer drew attention as an anomaly, but instead had become an unspoken reference point for calm. The turbulence persisted, not intensifying dramatically, but continuing with a sustained rhythm that made every passenger aware of the aircraft's ongoing movement through unstable air. David Whitmore sat across the aisle, his earlier uncertainty now evolving into quiet reflection, his gaze occasionally shifting between Alicia and the front of the cabin without the sharpness of judgment he had shown earlier. The flight attendant continued her careful movement through the aisle, her actions precise and controlled, pausing intermittently to check seat belts and ensure that passengers remained secure, her voice low and steady when offering brief reassurance. Outside the windows, the sky had become an uninterrupted field of dense cloud formations, layered and shifting, eliminating any sense of visible horizon and reinforcing the feeling of being suspended within a vast, indistinct space. The aircraft responded with a gradual adjustment in altitude, producing a smooth but noticeable motion that passed through the cabin and triggered a collective, almost synchronized stillness among passengers. Alicia's breathing remained even and unbroken, her focus inward and unwavering, her calm presence consistent despite the continued instability surrounding her. Her lips moved faintly again in the same quiet rhythm, a steady internal focus that did not react to the external environment but remained anchored in something deeper and personal. A nearby passenger, who had earlier displayed visible irritation, now observed her in silence with an expression that had softened into quiet contemplation, as if trying to reconcile the contrast between her composure and the shared tension around them. The aircraft shifted again in a longer, sustained motion, not abrupt but continuous, drawing a subtle tightening across the cabin as passengers instinctively adjusted their posture and grip on armrests and seatbacks. The silence that followed was not empty but full, carrying the collective awareness of everyone on board that the situation remained unresolved and required patience. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders no longer rigid but no longer relaxed, suspended in a state of uncertain acceptance. He looked toward Alicia once more, and this time his expression carried something different from earlier, not skepticism or discomfort, but a quiet acknowledgement of consistency that he could not easily dismiss. The flight attendant paused briefly near the front, speaking softly into her headset before continuing her steady movement, reinforcing the structure and order that kept the cabin grounded despite the shifting conditions. Alicia adjusted her position slightly in response to the aircraft's motion, her movement natural and minimal, her expression unchanged and calm, unaffected by the fluctuations around her. The cabin had now entered a unified state of quiet endurance, where every passenger shared the same awareness that the journey was still unfolding, and that the only constant within the moment was the steady passage of time through uncertainty. The aircraft continued its steady movement through the layered sky, maintaining a controlled but constantly shifting rhythm that had become the new normal for everyone on board, a rhythm defined not by comfort but by adaptation to uncertainty. The cabin lighting remained soft and consistent, casting an even glow across rows of passengers who now sat in a shared state of quiet focus, their earlier emotional fluctuations replaced by a collective attentiveness to every subtle change in motion. Alicia Carter remained seated in the same composed posture she had held since the beginning of the turbulence, her hands still gently resting together, her expression calm and unchanged, a steady presence that no longer stood apart from the cabin but seemed to quietly influence its tone. The aircraft entered another sustained movement, longer and smoother than before, but still enough to remind every passenger of the invisible forces surrounding them. David Whitmore sat across the aisle in a silence that was no longer shaped by uncertainty alone, but by reflection, his earlier assumptions about the situation now replaced by a more grounded awareness of how quickly perception could shift when conditions changed. His gaze moved toward Alicia once more, lingering longer than before, not with judgment, but with a quiet recognition of consistency under pressure. The flight attendant continued her measured movement through the aisle, her steps precise, her attention divided between passenger safety and cockpit communication, her calm presence maintaining structure within the shifting environment. Outside the windows, the sky remained fully obscured by dense, layered cloud systems, eliminating any visual reference point and reinforcing the sense that the aircraft was moving through an undefined space where direction could only be measured internally. The turbulence persisted in a steady pattern, not escalating but not fading, creating a continuous sensation of motion that required ongoing adjustment from everyone on board. Alicia's breathing remained even and steady, her focus inward, her calm unchanged despite the continued instability around her. Her lips moved faintly again in the same quiet rhythm, consistent and unbroken, as if she were anchored to something that did not respond to external conditions. A nearby passenger, once visibly irritated earlier in the flight, now watched her in silence with an expression that suggested contemplation rather than reaction, as though the earlier assumptions about her presence no longer aligned with what they were witnessing in real time. The aircraft shifted again in a long, controlled motion that passed through the cabin, like a slow wave, prompting a synchronized tightening of posture among passengers before gradually easing into stillness once more. The silence that followed was not empty but attentive, filled with the awareness that the situation was still ongoing and required patience rather than reaction. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders no longer tense but not fully relaxed, suspended in a quiet state of acceptance that had replaced his earlier resistance. He looked toward Alicia again, and this time his expression carried a subtle acknowledgement of something he could not easily dismiss, a recognition of stability that remained unchanged regardless of external movement. The flight attendant paused briefly near the front of the cabin, speaking softly into her headset before continuing her steady progression down the aisle, reinforcing a sense of order that remained essential within the shifting environment. Alicia adjusted her position slightly in response to the aircraft's motion, her movement minimal and natural, her composure uninterrupted. The cabin had now fully transitioned into a unified state of silent endurance, where every passenger shared the same understanding that the journey continued forward through uncertainty, and that within that uncertainty, calm presence had become the only form of stability they could collectively rely on. The aircraft moved forward through the dense and shifting layers of cloud with a steady persistence that now felt less like turbulence and more like passage through an extended threshold of uncertainty, where every movement was expected but never fully predictable. The cabin remained dimly lit with a consistent amber glow, casting soft shadows across rows of passengers who had long since abandoned any pretense of casual comfort. Instead, they sat in quiet alignment with the rhythm of the aircraft, their bodies reacting subtly to every shift in motion. Alicia Carter remained in her seat with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout the entire flight, her hands still gently folded, her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that had now become familiar to those around her rather than questioned. The turbulence continued in a sustained and controlled pattern, not escalating but also not resolving, creating a constant undercurrent of motion that shaped the collective awareness of everyone on board. David Whitmore sat across the aisle in a stillness that had evolved further from earlier uncertainty into quiet introspection, his gaze occasionally drifting toward Alicia before returning forward, no longer with resistance, but with a measured attempt to understand consistency in contrast to surrounding instability. The flight attendant continued her careful movement through the aisle, her presence steady and professional, offering brief reassurances when needed, ensuring that all passengers remained secure as the aircraft maintained its course through unsettled atmospheric conditions. Outside the windows, the sky remained fully obscured by thick cloud formations, eliminating any visual horizon and reinforcing the sense of isolation within a controlled environment suspended between departure and arrival. The aircraft shifted again in a long, smooth motion that passed through the cabin like a quiet wave, prompting a brief synchronized tightening among passengers before settling once more into steady movement. Alicia's breathing remained even and controlled, her focus inward, her calm presence unchanged despite the continued motion surrounding her. Her lips moved faintly again in the same quiet rhythm, consistent and unbroken, a subtle internal focus that did not respond to external variation. A nearby passenger who had once expressed visible irritation earlier in the flight now observed her in silence with an expression that had shifted fully into contemplation, as though trying to reconcile earlier assumptions with what had unfolded over time. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowered slightly, his posture no longer rigid but not entirely relaxed, suspended in a state of quiet awareness that reflected a deeper change in perception. He looked toward Alicia again, and this time his expression carried a subtle acknowledgement that did not require words, a recognition of steadiness that persisted regardless of external conditions. The flight attendant paused briefly near the front of the cabin, speaking softly into her headset before continuing her measured movement down the aisle, maintaining structure and calm throughout the ongoing flight. Alicia adjusted her position slightly in response to the aircraft's motion, her movement minimal and natural, her composure uninterrupted. The cabin had now fully settled into a unified state of quiet endurance, where every passenger shared the same awareness that the journey continued forward through uncertainty, and that stability, in this moment, was defined not by the absence of motion, but by the ability to remain steady within it. The aircraft continued its steady forward movement through the dense atmospheric layers, maintaining a controlled and consistent rhythm that had gradually become the new normal for everyone on board, where motion no longer felt sudden but continuous, and anticipation had replaced surprise. The cabin lighting remained soft and unchanged, casting an even amber tone across rows of passengers who now sat in quiet alignment with the aircraft's persistent movement. Alicia Carter remained seated with the same composed stillness she had maintained since the beginning of the turbulence, her hands still gently folded, her posture unchanged, her expression calm and steady in a way that no longer drew attention but instead seemed to anchor the atmosphere around her. The turbulence persisted in a long, stable pattern, neither increasing nor fading completely, but continuing as a sustained presence that shaped every breath and every subtle movement within the cabin. David Whitmore sat across the aisle in a silence that had fully transitioned from earlier judgment into quiet contemplation, his gaze occasionally shifting toward Alicia before returning forward, not with resistance, but with a growing awareness of how perception changes under sustained uncertainty. The flight attendant continued her measured movement through the aisle, her steps precise and controlled, pausing only to ensure passengers remained secure and calm, her voice soft and steady when offering reassurance or instruction. Outside the windows, the sky remained fully obscured by thick, layered cloud formations, erasing any sense of horizon and reinforcing the feeling that the aircraft was moving through an environment without visible boundaries, guided only by instruments and steady expertise. The aircraft shifted again in a long, smooth motion that passed through the cabin like a slow wave, prompting a brief collective tightening among passengers before settling once more into steady endurance. Alicia's breathing remained even and uninterrupted, her focus internal and unwavering, her calm presence unchanged despite the continued motion surrounding her. Her lips moved faintly again in the same quiet rhythm that had remained consistent throughout the flight, a subtle internal focus that did not respond to external fluctuations but remained anchored within itself. A nearby passenger, who had earlier shown visible irritation at the beginning of the flight, now watched her in silence with an expression that had fully shifted into contemplation, as if reconsidering earlier assumptions in light of what had unfolded over time. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders slightly lowered, his posture no longer rigid but not fully relaxed, suspended in a quiet awareness that reflected a deeper shift in understanding. He looked toward Alicia once more, and this time his expression carried a subtle acknowledgement that required no explanation, only recognition of consistency under conditions that affected everyone equally. The flight attendant paused briefly near the front of the cabin, speaking softly into her headset before continuing her steady progression down the aisle, maintaining structure and calm throughout the ongoing journey. Alicia adjusted her position slightly in response to the aircraft's motion, her movement minimal and natural, her composure uninterrupted. The cabin had now fully entered a unified state of silent endurance, where every passenger shared the same understanding that the flight was still in progress, and that stability in this moment was not defined by stillness, but by the ability to remain steady while everything continued to move. The aircraft began its final steady phase of flight through the remaining stretch of unsettled sky, the motion now smoother and more controlled, as if the atmosphere itself was gradually yielding to the aircraft's persistent forward progress. The cabin lighting remained soft and consistent, casting a warm and even glow that contrasted with the emotional quiet that had settled over every passenger. There was no longer any sense of division within the cabin, no earlier irritation or judgment, only a shared stillness shaped by endurance and time. Alicia Carter remained seated exactly as she had been throughout the entire flight, her posture unchanged, her hands still gently folded, her expression calm and steady, carrying the same quiet presence that had remained constant through every shift in the aircraft's movement. The turbulence had lessened into a gentle, barely noticeable motion, more like a residual echo of earlier instability than an active force, allowing passengers to slowly release the tension they had carried for what felt like an extended stretch of time. David Whitmore sat across the aisle in a posture that had softened significantly from earlier in the flight, his shoulders no longer rigid, his hands resting more loosely on the armrests, his gaze no longer scanning for uncertainty, but instead resting quietly in front of him. When he finally looked toward Alicia, there was no trace of frustration or disbelief, only a calm recognition of consistency that had remained unchanged regardless of everything that had unfolded around them. The flight attendant continued her final checks through the aisle with the same professional composure she had maintained throughout the journey, her movements steady and deliberate, ensuring that every passenger remained secure as the aircraft prepared for descent. Outside the windows, the dense cloud formations had begun to thin, revealing faint gradients of lighter sky beyond, suggesting that the aircraft was gradually leaving the most unstable region of atmosphere behind. The motion of the aircraft became smoother, transitioning from sustained turbulence into gentle, controlled descent adjustments that passed through the cabin with minimal disturbance. Alicia's breathing remained even and unbroken, her focus still inward, her calm presence unchanged even as the external environment shifted toward stability. Her lips moved faintly one final time in the same quiet rhythm she had maintained throughout the flight, consistent and unbroken, as if concluding an internal reflection that had remained steady from beginning to end. A nearby passenger who had once reacted with visible irritation now sat in complete silence, their expression fully softened into quiet understanding, no longer focused on differences but on what had been observed over time. David exhaled slowly, his posture relaxed now in a way it had not been earlier, his attention no longer divided or uncertain, but settled into a quiet acknowledgement of what he had witnessed. The cabin remained silent, not from tension, but from a shared sense of completion, as the aircraft stabilized further and the descent continued smoothly toward its destination. The flight attendant made one final pass through the aisle, her presence calm and assured, before returning to her position, signaling that the most uncertain phase of the journey had passed. Alicia adjusted her position slightly as the aircraft leveled into a smoother descent, her movement natural and minimal, her expression unchanged. In the final quiet of the cabin, there was no longer reaction or division.